The morning Arthur Townsend saddled his horse for what he had promised himself was the very last time, the sky over the New Mexico territory burned the color of a wound, and Lydia Ford was standing at the well with her hair loose and her sleeves rolled to her elbows, and he forgot entirely what leaving was supposed to feel like. It was the autumn of 1882, and the territory was no country for a man who had run out of reasons to stay. At least that was what Arthur had told himself on the first occasion he had packed his saddlebags, back in the spring when the mud was still thick along the Rio Puico, and the nights carried a cold that got into a man's bones and reminded him he was not as young as he used to be. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered in the way that the desert made men lean and weathered, with dark eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize it quickly in others, and hands calloused from years of working ranches that were never quite his own. He had drifted into the town of Caldera Creek the previous October looking for seasonal work, and had found it at the Mercer outfit on the eastern edge of town, breaking horses and mending fence lines, and doing all the quiet, grinding labor that kept a ranch alive through the winter months. He had not planned to know anyone in Caldera Creek beyond his employer and the men he worked alongside. That was the arrangement that had suited him for the better part of a decade, moving from territory to territory, working long enough to fill his pockets, and then moving again before the place could get its hooks into him. He had been in Arizona before this, and before that Colorado, and before that Kansas, and each place had offered him enough of what a man needed to survive and nothing of what a man needed to feel like he was living. He had grown comfortable in the numbness of it, the way a man grows comfortable in a coat that does not quite fit because at least it keeps the wind out. Lydia Ford had not been a part of his plans. She ran the dry goods store on the main street of Caldera Creek, a narrow-fronted building with whitewashed boards and a sign her late father had painted himself in uneven letters that she had never had the heart to replace. She had inherited the store 2 years prior when her father, Lydia Ford, had died of a fever that moved through town the summer before Arthur arrived, taking 3 men and 1 child, and leaving behind a particular kind of grief that Caldera Creek wore like a permanent garment. Lydia had been 26 at the time of her father's death, and she had stepped into the running of the store with the kind of quiet determination that people admired from a distance and rarely thought to actually help with. Arthur had gone into the store that first October for flour and salt and a length of rope, things he needed and nothing more. Lydia had been reorganizing the shelves at the back, standing on a step stool that was too short for the task, stretching up on her toes to reach the uppermost shelf, and Arthur had stood at the counter for a full 2 minutes before she had noticed him. When she turned around, she had a smudge of dust on her cheek, and an expression that was not quite apologetic and not quite proud, but something balanced between the two, like a woman who knew she was supposed to apologize for making a customer wait, but had not entirely decided whether she agreed with that social obligation. "I'll be right with you," she had said, and he had said, "No rush," and that had been the whole of it, but he had thought about that expression for 3 days afterward without being able to explain why. He had gone back for tobacco the following week, though he had enough tobacco to last another 2 weeks at least. By December, he was finding reasons to stop in twice a week, and Lydia Ford had begun to set aside the particular brand of tobacco he preferred without him asking, which she told him was simply good business practice, and he had accepted this explanation because he did not yet know what to do with the alternative. She was a woman of remarkable practical intelligence, and this was the thing that struck him most about her in those early months, before the feelings grew complicated enough to require a different kind of vocabulary. She knew the price of every item in her store without consulting any ledger. She knew which ranchers paid on time and which ones needed gentle reminding. She knew when the supply wagon from Santa Fe would be late based on the weather and the mood of the driver, a man called Clement who had a knee that predicted rain 3 days in advance. She kept her accounts in a small leather-bound book with meticulous handwriting, and she maintained the store's inventory with the same careful attention to detail that a general might bring to the management of a campaign. She was also funny in the dry, understated way that people from lonely places develop, a humor that arrived quietly and did not announce itself, and it had taken Arthur several encounters before he realized he was laughing at things she said, and then several more before he understood that he looked forward to laughing at things she said. Christmas of 1881 came and went, and Arthur stayed at the Mercer outfit because the winter work was steady and the pay was honest. He told himself that was the reason. In January, he had his first real conversation with Lydia Ford, a conversation that lasted longer than any exchange involving the purchase of goods had any business lasting. She had asked him where he was from, and he had told her a version of the truth, that he was from Virginia originally but that he had not been back in a long time, and she had said that she understood that feeling, that a person could be from a place without the place having any remaining claim on them. He had looked at her carefully when she said this, because it was a complicated thing to say, and most people in small towns did not say complicated things without meaning them. "Your family still there?" she had asked. "Mother passed when I was 17, he had said. Father not long after. I had a brother but we lost touch years back. I expect he's doing fine without the correspondence." There had been no pity in her face, which he appreciated, only a kind of recognition, like someone identifying a landmark they have seen before in a different country. "I understand that too," she had said, and he knew she was thinking about her father, and he had not pressed, because some griefs are not for pressing. That conversation had changed the nature of what existed between them, though neither of them would have been capable of naming what that nature was for some time afterward. It moved things from the territory of pleasant commerce into something warmer and more uncertain, a no-man's land where two people walk carefully, because the ground has not yet been surveyed, and nobody can say with certainty where it is safe to step. February brought a hard freeze that cracked two of the water pipes at the Mercer outfit, and kept Arthur and the other hands working in brutal cold for a week to repair them. He went into the store on a Thursday afternoon with his hands so stiff he could barely manage the door latch, and Lydia had taken one look at him and disappeared into the back and returned with a cup of coffee that she handed across the counter without any comment, as though this was a thing she did for all her customers, which it very plainly was not. He had wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth travel up his arms and into his chest, and he had looked at her over the rim and thought, with a sudden and disorienting clarity, that he was in serious trouble. "Thank you," he had said. "Cold's bad this week," she had said, already busy with something else, not looking at him, and he understood that she had given him the coffee and the privacy of her not watching him receive it, which was its own kind of grace. The first time he had decided to leave the territory was in March of 1882. He had been at the Mercer Ranch for 5 months, which was longer than he usually stayed anywhere, and he had begun to feel the familiar restlessness that always preceded his departures, the sense that a place was starting to know him too well, that the walls were closing in on something he needed to keep in open air. He had a friend, if friend was the right word, a man named Cal Draper who worked the ranches along the Pecos River and who wrote letters occasionally suggesting that there was good money to be made in the cattle drives heading north toward Colorado. Arthur had written back saying he would come in the spring. He had started making preparations in his mind, calculating distances, thinking about the route. He had gone into Ford's dry goods on a Wednesday with no particular purpose, because he was leaving anyway, and so the usual concerns about purpose had seemed moot. Lydia had been at the counter dealing with an unpleasant situation involving a rancher named Gideon Prout, a man in his 50s with a large ranch west of town, and an apparent conviction that the rules of commerce did not apply to him in the same way they applied to lesser individuals. He was telling Lydia, in a tone that mixed condescension with threat in proportions that made Arthur's jaw tighten from across the room, that she had given him the wrong count on a barrel of nails, and that she ought to correct the ledger in his favor, or he would take his business to the supply outfit in Magdalena. Lydia was listening to this with an expression of perfect, polite, controlled patience, the kind that is not really patience at all but something tougher dressed up in patience's clothes. She had the ledger open on the counter and her finger on a line of numbers, and when Prout finished she said, in a calm and even voice, that the ledger showed 38 nails purchased, the same number recorded on his own receipt which she could see in his breast pocket, and that if he wished to check the mathematics she was happy to wait while he did so. Prout's face had gone an unpleasant color, and he had leaned forward over the counter in a way that Arthur did not like at all, and Arthur had moved from the doorway to the counter in 3 long strides, not quickly enough to seem alarmed but quickly enough to be present, and had said, pleasantly, that he needed to pick up his order when Lydia had a free moment. Prout had looked at him. Arthur had looked back. There was a particular kind of conversation that happened between men in the West that did not require words, and this was one of them. Prout had straightened up, tucked his receipt back into his pocket, said something dismissive about the quality of dry goods in general, and left. Lydia had watched him go and then looked at Arthur with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that might have been irritation, and said, "I had that well in hand." "I know you did," Arthur had said. "I just wanted my tobacco." The corner of her mouth had moved in a way that might have been the beginning of a smile, and she had turned to pull his tobacco from the shelf behind her, the one where she kept it set aside for him, and he had paid and left and gotten halfway to the Mercer Ranch before he realized he had forgotten entirely about leaving for the Pecos River. He had sat with this realization for a while, there in the saddle with the spring wind blowing dust across the road, and he had made a decision that he did not examine too carefully, because examined too carefully it would not have held. He had written to Cal Draper and told him that he had decided to stay on in Caldera Creek for the time being. He had felt, putting the letter in the mail, both relieved and slightly ashamed of himself, though he could not have precisely articulated the reason for the shame. Spring turned to early summer, and Arthur began to find himself at Ford's Dry Goods with a frequency that was no longer even nominally explained by the purchase of goods. He brought Lydia news from the ranches, because she liked to know what was happening in the wider territory even though she rarely had time to leave the store. He fixed the step stool that was too short, building her a better one from lumber he brought from the Mercer outfit on a Saturday afternoon, and she had looked at the new stool and then at him with an expression that was more complicated than gratitude and less simple than surprise. "You didn't have to do that," she had said. "I know," he had said. He had also, around this time, begun to understand something about Lydia Ford that made his feeling for her more particular and more careful than feelings of simple attraction. She was a woman who had arranged her life in the shape of independence, because independence was what remained after loss had removed the other options, and she wore that arrangement with a dignity that was real and earned. But underneath it, if you paid attention, you could see the cost of it. The way she sometimes paused in the middle of a transaction and looked at the door as though she was remembering when her father would walk through it. The way she kept his painting on the sign despite its imperfections. The way she was generous with the children in town and the older women who came in to talk as much as to buy, as though she understood the particular loneliness of people who have to manufacture their own company. He paid attention. He had always been a man who paid attention, though previously this quality had not had much to attach itself to. In June, the town of Caldera Creek had a dance. It was not an elaborate affair, a clearing behind the saloon, a fiddle player and a guitar player who knew about 20 songs between them, paper lanterns strung from posts that someone had hammered into the ground at irregular intervals, and the better part of the town's population dressed in their best clothes and trying to remember the last time they had done anything simply for the pleasure of it. Arthur went because the ranch hands were going, and it would have been conspicuous not to. He told himself this firmly before getting there. He had found Lydia near the edge of the dancing, talking to the school teacher, a woman named Mrs. Albright, who taught the 20-odd children of Caldera Creek in a building that was simultaneously the school, the church, and the meeting hall, which was a testament to the territory's tendency to require every building to earn its keep several times over. Lydia was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a dark blue that made the brown of her eyes look warmer, and her hair was up in a way that was careful but not elaborate, and she had a quality of quiet ease about her that he associated with the few occasions he had seen her outside the store, as though the store required her to be capable and alert, and being outside it allowed her to simply be. He had asked her to dance. He had not planned to ask her to dance. The words had arrived in his mouth before his good judgment had finished the relevant deliberations. She had looked at him for a moment in the way she sometimes did, measuring something, and then she had said yes, and they had danced 2 dances because the fiddle player moved from one song to the next without stopping, and then they had stood at the edge of the clearing and talked while the rest of the town danced around them, and Arthur had thought, with that same disorienting clarity he had experienced in February, that he was not simply in serious trouble, but in the specific kind of trouble that a man does not particularly want to get out of. He had walked her to the door of the store afterward, because she lived in the 2 rooms above it, and at the door she had turned to thank him, and he had said that the thanks were unnecessary, and she had said good night in a tone that held something uncertain in it, something that was almost a question, and he had said good night and walked back to the ranch in the warm June dark with his heart doing something complicated in his chest. It was July when he decided to leave the territory for the second time. A man he had once worked with in Colorado arrived in Caldera Creek, a drifter named Wade Briggs, with news from the north that the cattle business up in the Colorado territory was booming, and that a man with Arthur's particular skills with horses could name his wages at any of half a dozen outfits near Pueblo. Wade was convincing in the way that restless men are convincing, because he described a life without complication, a life of movement and money, and the clean simplicity of work without attachment. Arthur had listened and felt the old restlessness stir in him, and he had begun, seriously, to consider it. He had mentioned it to no one. He had packed nothing. But he had found himself standing in front of the Mercer Ranch's main, building one evening thinking about Colorado with what felt like genuine intention, calculating what he owed and what he was owed, and what a man reasonably required before moving on. And the calculation had been coming out in Colorado's favor when a boy from town had come running down the road calling for help, because there was a fire at Ford's dry goods. It had not been a serious fire. A lamp had been knocked over in the storeroom, and the fire had caught on a shelf of dry goods before Lydia had put it out herself with a bucket of sand. She kept near the back door for precisely this reason. By the time Arthur arrived, having ridden harder than he should have, the fire was out and there was smoke, and the smell of scorched wood and some ruined stock, and Lydia was standing in the storeroom with a blackened face and an expression of exhausted frustration looking at the damage. She had looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and something in her expression had shifted in a way that she had immediately controlled, but he had seen it before it was controlled. The brief and unguarded flicker of relief that had crossed her face when she saw him specifically. Not just help, but him, and the sight of it had struck him somewhere behind his ribs with the force of a physical thing. "I've got it handled," she had said, her voice steadier than her expression. "I can see that," he had said. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she had said, and then, after a moment, "The inventory is going to be a problem. I lost about $40 of stock." $40 can be replaced," he had said. She had looked at him with something tired and real in her eyes and said, "Yes, I know, I'm all right, Arthur." It was the first time she had used his given name without the prefix, and he was not sure she had noticed she had done it, but he had noticed, and he had stayed for another hour helping her clear out the damaged shelving and assess what could be saved and what could not. And by the time he rode back to the Mercer Ranch, the Colorado decision had dissolved without being formally retracted, and he understood, with a kind of rueful humor he could not share with anyone, that he had been defeated by a fire that had lasted less than 10 minutes. He had not written to Wade Briggs. August and September passed in the particular heat of the New Mexico Territory in late summer, which was not a comfortable heat but a serious and punishing one, the kind that made every physical task feel like an argument with the landscape. Arthur worked hard and saw Lydia frequently, and the thing between them grew the way things grow in difficult climates, slowly and with strong roots, because everything that survives the desert has learned to send its roots deep before it shows anything above ground. They had, by September, moved into a kind of comfortable proximity that was different from friendship and different from courtship, and occupied a territory that neither of them had quite named. He helped her with things. She made coffee for him. They talked for longer than could be justified by any commercial transaction, about the town and the territory and things they had read and things they thought about. She had strong opinions, which she expressed without apology once she trusted that her opinions would be received without dismissal, a trust that had taken some time to develop because experience had taught her to expect dismissal. He disagreed with her sometimes, honestly, and this seemed to please her more than agreement would have, because she had grown accustomed to men who disagreed with her privately and patronized her publicly. One afternoon in late September she had let him in through the back when the store was closed for the half-day she took on Sundays, and they had sat in the small kitchen above the store, which was the first time he had been in the living quarters, and the intimacy of the space had made them both slightly formal in a way that was not unpleasant, a formality that acknowledged that something was being established between them without requiring either of them to say what it was. She had shown him a book she was reading, a novel she had ordered specially from a bookseller in Santa Fe, and they had talked about it for a while and then about other books, and then she had said with a casualness that was not entirely casual that she had not talked about books with anyone in a long time. "My father liked to read," she had said. "We would argue about things we read in the evenings after supper. I miss that." "What did you argue about?" he had asked. She had smiled, a real one, the kind that reached her eyes. Everything, history, politics, whether a particular character in a novel had made the right choice. He had very definite ideas about what people ought to do, and I had very definite ideas that were often different. She had paused. He would have liked you, I think. He respected people who were sure of themselves without needing everyone else to agree. Arthur had not known what to do with this, the weight of it, the gift of being told that the dead would have approved of you. He had said quietly, "That means something, Lydia, thank you." She had looked at her coffee cup, and he had looked at her, and the afternoon light had come through the single window, and the silence had been the kind that does not require filling. October came, and with October came a new complication that arrived in the form of a man named Robert Hensley. Hensley was from back east, from St. Louis, and he came to Caldera Creek as a representative of a mercantile company that was looking to expand its operations in the New Mexico Territory. He was well-dressed and well-spoken, and about 35 years old, with the smooth confidence of a man who has grown up in a world where his confidence is regularly validated. He came into Ford's Dry Goods on a Tuesday morning and proposed, in courteous and detailed terms, that Lydia sell the store to his company. He offered her a fair price, perhaps even a generous one, and he framed the offer in language that made it sound like he was doing her a favor. Arthur heard about this from Lydia on Wednesday when he stopped in on his way back from the eastern pasture. She told him about it in a level voice that was doing considerable work to remain level. "What did you tell him?" Arthur asked. "I told him the store wasn't for sale," she said. "He told me he'd be in town for another week and the offer would remain open." "What are you going to do?" She looked at him with a steadiness that he found both impressive and slightly heartbreaking. "Nothing. It isn't for sale. That's the end of it. But it was not quite the end of it, because Hensley, who was clearly not a man who accepted the first answer as the final one, had begun making a social effort in Caldera Creek that was notable for its particular direction. He had dinner at the hotel dining room twice and sat near the table where Lydia took her Sunday meal with Mrs. Albright and a few other women from town. He had come into the store on Thursday for things he demonstrably did not need. A man from St. Louis with no ranch and no permanent address had no use for a leather harness buckle or a bag of cornmeal, and he had been charming in a way that was technically appropriate and subtly overbearing. Arthur had found this difficult to sit with. He had found it difficult in a way that told him things about himself that he was not entirely ready to face. On Friday evening, he had gone to the store just before closing, which was unusual, and Lydia had been counting the day's receipts at the counter with her reading glasses on, which she only wore when she thought she was alone. She had looked up and taken the glasses off quickly, and he had noticed her taking them off, and she had noticed him noticing, and they had both pretended none of this had happened. He had said that he wanted to ask her something, and she had put the receipts down and looked at him with the careful, measuring attention she gave to things that mattered. He had asked her if Hensley was making her uncomfortable. She had considered the question seriously before answering, which was characteristic. Not uncomfortable, she had said, more like persistent, in a way that doesn't hear no very well. I don't like it, he had said. I noticed, she had said, which stopped him, because he had not realized he had been obvious, and the fact that she had noticed meant she had been watching him with the same attention he had been giving to everything involving her. They had looked at each other in the lamplit store with the receipts between them and the glasses she had taken off her face sitting on the counter, and something had shifted, slightly, incrementally, between them. Not resolved, not spoken, but moved. Hensley had come in on Saturday with a revised offer and a manner that had grown, in Arthur's estimation, too friendly by half. Arthur had been at the store at the time, supposedly examining a selection of leather goods he had no particular need for, and he had watched Lydia decline the second offer with the same composed clarity she had brought to the first, and he had watched Hensley accept this with a smile that suggested the decline was provisional rather than real, and something in Arthur's chest had drawn itself up like a man preparing for weather. He had not said anything. It was not his store, and it was not his decision, and Lydia Ford was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs, which he knew better than most. But after Hensley left, he had remained, and Lydia had looked at him with an expression that was tired and slightly exasperated, and something else underneath that, something softer, and she had said, "He'll be gone by the end of the week." "You're sure?" Arthur had asked. "Men like that always move on," she had said. "There's always another opportunity somewhere else." She had paused, and her expression had shifted into something more deliberate, more direct. Unlike men who say they're leaving and then don't. The room had gone very quiet. He had looked at her carefully and said, "Has someone mentioned that I considered leaving in the spring? Cal Draper wrote a letter to someone in town asking if you'd ever shown up or whether he should start looking for another writer," she had said. "Word gets around in a small town." He had felt the back of his neck grow warm. "I stayed," he had said. "You did," she had said, and her voice carried something in it that was question and observation and perhaps, underneath both, something tentative and brave. Why? It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him. He understood that it had cost her something to say it, that it was a door opened at personal risk, and that the wrong answer or no answer would close it permanently and damage something that he had come to value more than he knew how to express. He had moved from the leather goods display to the counter, and he had stood across from her with only the counter between them, and he had said, in a voice that was quieter than usual but carried the particular quality of things that are being said for the first and only time, "Because I realized that whatever I was looking for when I moved from place to place, I had found something better here without looking for it at all. And I was not quite foolish enough to ride away from that. The silence that followed was the kind that holds its breath. Lydia had looked at him for a long time with the reading glasses still on the counter between them, and then she had said, "I have been extremely careful not to presume anything about what you intended by coming here as often as you do." "I know," he had said. "You've been very patient with my considerable lack of directness." "I have," she had agreed, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I would like to call on you properly," he had said, "if you're willing, not as a customer." She had taken a breath that was slow and deliberate and said, "I think I have been expecting that question since approximately March, and I have some very well-considered thoughts about the answer." "And what are they?" he had asked. "Yes," she had said, simply, with her chin slightly raised and her brown eyes steady on his and the lamplight warm on her face. Yes. He had not kissed her that evening. He had been old-fashioned enough about some things to think that a proper courtship ought to begin with some breathing room. And besides, the feeling in his chest was too large and too new to rush, like a room you want to stand in for a moment before you start moving the furniture. Hensley left at the end of the following week, as Lydia had predicted, with a final visit to the store in which he had offered a third and final price, which Lydia had declined with a politeness so complete and immovable that it left Hensley nothing to work against. He had tipped his hat at the door and gone, and Lydia had watched him go and turned to Arthur, who had been present and quiet in the corner, and said, "There. See." And Arthur had said, "You're remarkable," and she had looked briefly startled, as though compliments of that particular kind arrived rarely enough to catch her off guard. The courtship that followed was characterized by the same quality that defined everything between them, a combination of seriousness and warmth, of directness earned slowly through demonstrated care. They went for walks on Sunday afternoons when the store was closed. He brought her things from the eastern pasture, wildflowers when they were still blooming, interesting stones, once a hawk feather that she put in a glass on the windowsill above the store's back counter. She lent him books and expected him to read them. He introduced her to the foreman at the Mercer Ranch, a gruff and decent man named Tucker, who had shaken her hand with the careful respect he reserved for people he found genuinely impressive. November was cold and sharp, and entirely the wrong season for sentiment, and he kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in November, outside the back door of the store in the cold and the dark, after a conversation that had gone long past the point of any commercial justification, and she had kissed him back with a completeness that told him she had been waiting with more patience than he deserved. They had stood in the cold for a moment afterward, both slightly breathless, and Lydia had said in a voice that was not quite steady, "I was beginning to think you were going to require another 8 months. I almost left the territory a second time," he had confessed. She had pulled back slightly and looked at him. "When?" "July, when Wade Briggs came through." She had processed this information with the careful attention she gave to everything. "What stopped you?" He had told her about the fire, about arriving and seeing her face, and the flicker of relief before she controlled it. She had listened to this with an expression that moved through several things in succession, and then she had said quietly, "I did not know you had been that close to leaving." "I was not as close as I thought I was," he had said. "I just hadn't figured out the reason yet." She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, in a voice that was honest and slightly vulnerable in a way she allowed rarely, "I'm glad you stayed, Arthur." "So am I," he had said, and the cold and the dark and the light from the store window had made the whole of it feel like something from a book she would have argued about with her father. December of 1882 was when the trouble with the Prout Ranch came to a head, and this was where things became complicated in a way that tested both of them. Gideon Prout, the rancher who had leaned over Lydia's counter in March with a face like a threat, had been buying on credit from the store since before Lydia Ford died. His account had grown over the 2 years since Lydia had taken over, grown in the way that unpaid debts grow when a creditor is too intimidated to press for payment, and a debtor has too much local influence to be pressed. Lydia had been pressing, quietly, through polite correspondence, for 6 months, and Pruitt had been ignoring the pressing, and the debt had grown to a figure that represented several months of the store's operating income. She had told Arthur about this in November, after the kiss and after the thing between them had moved into clearer territory. She had shown him the account book with a directness that said she trusted him with the real shape of her situation, not just the presentable version of it. He had looked at the numbers and understood why she had been working as hard as she had been working. The store was profitable but not comfortable, and an unpaid debt of this size was a genuine threat to its operation. "What are you going to do?" he had asked. "I've written twice more this month," she had said. "If he doesn't respond by the 1st of December, I'll take it to the Justice of the Peace." "Pruitt has friends with the Justice of the Peace," Arthur had said carefully. "I know that," she had said. "But the law is the law, and the debt is documented." He had not argued with her plan because it was a sound plan, and it was her store. But he had also gone, on a Saturday in late November, to find Pruitt at the general gathering of ranchers that happened at the saloon on the last Saturday of each month. He had sat across from Pruitt at a table, with 2 other ranchers present as inadvertent witnesses, and had a conversation about the nature of debts and the character of men who honored them. A conversation that was civil throughout and nonetheless carried, in the specific way of such conversations between men in the West, a very clear message about what Arthur's continued attention to the matter would look like if Pruitt chose the alternative. Pruitt had paid the debt in full on the 4th of December. Lydia had found out inevitably, because in a town of Caldera Creek size everything was found out eventually. She had been cross with him about it, in the measured, controlled way she had of being cross, which was more effective than shouting because it was entirely specific and left no room for deflection. "I do not need you to fight my battles," she had said, standing in her kitchen above the store with her arms folded and her eyes direct. "I know you don't," he had said. "You had it in hand. You had the Justice of the Peace route planned, and it was a good plan and it would have worked. Then why?" He had taken a moment with the answer because he wanted to get it right. "Because watching someone you care about carry a burden they could share is harder than any work I know how to do," he had said. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Lydia. I'm trying to be someone who stands with you rather than next to you." She had held the position for a moment, and then it had released, the tension in her arms and her jaw and around her eyes, and she had looked at him with something that was complex and real and not entirely comfortable. The way feelings that have grown past what you planned for them are sometimes not entirely comfortable, and she had said, "I am not accustomed to people standing with me." "I know," he had said. "I'd like to change that, if you'll let me." She had looked at him for a long moment in her small, careful kitchen, and then she had crossed the room and he had put his arms around her, and she had put her forehead against his shoulder, and they had stood that way for a while in a silence that held everything that needed to be said without requiring any of it to be spoken. January of 1883 came in with a storm that blew down 3 of the Mercer Ranch's outbuildings and kept every hand working double shifts for a week. Arthur had sent a note to Lydia on the first day of the storm saying he would be unavailable until the damage was repaired, and she had sent back a note saying she understood and to take care, and a small parcel that contained 2 things, a pair of thick wool gloves and a square of gingerbread wrapped in cloth, neither of which required any explanation. He had kept the note. He was not a man who kept notes. He kept this one in his coat pocket until it fell apart. February brought a different kind of difficulty. The Mercer Ranch's owner, a man named James Mercer who spent most of his time in Santa Fe and allowed his foreman Tucker to manage the day-to-day operations, came through Caldera Creek for his annual inspection and spent 3 days reviewing the ranch's books and productivity. He was satisfied mostly, but he told Tucker and Arthur both that he was considering selling the eastern section of the ranch to pay off debts he had accumulated in Santa Fe, and that if he did, he would need to reduce the number of hands he was keeping on. There was a strong possibility, Mercer said, with the frankness of a man who believed in direct communications, that Arthur's position would not survive the spring. Arthur had sat with this for a day before telling Lydia. When he told her, she had listened without comment through the whole of it, and then she had asked what he was thinking. "I'm thinking about what comes next," he had said. "Whether it's another ranch or something different." "Something different how?" she had asked carefully. He had been thinking about this for weeks, not in any complete or structured way, but in the way that a plan assembles itself from materials that have been accumulating without apparent purpose. He had some money saved, more than most hands his age, because he had been drifting without dependence for a decade and had not spent on much beyond necessities. He had skills beyond ranch work, carpentry and horses, and a reasonable head for practical problems. The territory was still raw in the way that raw country is raw, full of needs that outpace the people and resources available to meet them. "There's a man in town named Holloway who's been talking about his grain operation like it's going to need another horse and a handler for the spring season," Arthur said. "That's not a long-term solution, but it's a start. What I've been thinking about, Lydia, is whether there's a future here that doesn't depend on which ranch will have me. Whether there's something I could build that's mine." She had looked at him with a thoughtfulness that had weight to it. "What would you build?" "I know horses better than most things," he had said. "Breaking them, training them, selecting them for specific work. There's a market for that in the territory. Ranches need good working horses, and they need them handled right. If I had a small piece of land and the capital to start modestly, I could build something over a few years." Lydia had been quiet for a long moment, and then she had said, very carefully, "Is this something you're considering for the future in general, or for the future here specifically?" He had looked at her steadily and said, "It's something I'm considering for the future here with you, if that's where we're going. I wouldn't be planting roots in this particular ground otherwise." The directness of it had landed between them with some force, because it was the most explicit either of them had been about the direction they were moving in. They had been walking toward this conversation for months, and now they were in it. "Is that what we're doing?" she had asked, and her voice was even, but her hands were not entirely still. "Building something together." "I think so," he had said. "I'd like to make it formal when you're ready. I'm not asking now because I don't think you've had enough time to make that decision, and I want you to make it with a full picture. But I'm telling you what I'm intending so you have the full picture." She had looked at him for a long time, and then she had said, "Arthur Townsend, you may be the most carefully honest man I have ever met. I've found that honesty costs less than the alternative in the long run," he had said. She had smiled at that, a real and wide smile, the kind he saw rarely enough that each one was a specific gift. "Give me some time," she had said, "not because I don't know my mind. I know my mind very well, but because some things deserve the courtesy of time." He had given her the time. He had done so with a grace that was not natural to his restless temperament, but that he had cultivated for precisely this purpose, because she was worth whatever patience he could manufacture. In March, precisely 1 year after he had first almost left the territory, Mercer sold the eastern section of the ranch, and Tucker regretfully told Arthur that the spring would be his last season at the Mercer outfit. Arthur had taken this with equanimity. He had already started a conversation with the Holloway grain operation, and had written 2 letters to ranchers south of Caldera Creek about a horse training arrangement. The ground was being prepared, slowly and deliberately, for whatever came next, and what came next arrived on a Tuesday evening in April. He had been at the store later than usual, helping Lydia reorganize the back room after a large shipment arrived, and they had worked together in the easy, comfortable way that 2 people work when they know each other's rhythms. And when the work was done, they had sat in the kitchen upstairs with coffee and the particular quality of tiredness that comes from good work done well. Lydia had her hair down because she had been working hard and she did not stand on ceremony in her own home, and the evening light was coming through the window, and everything was quiet and domestic and entirely right in a way that Arthur had never experienced before and had not known he was lacking until he had found it. He had known, clearly and without drama, that this was what he wanted for the rest of his life. Not the restlessness, not the road, not the clean, empty mornings in places that did not know his name. This kitchen. This woman with her hair down and her reading glasses on the table and her coffee cup in her hands, and the sense that the world outside was far enough away to be manageable. He had reached into his coat pocket and taken out a ring. It was not elaborate. It had belonged to his mother, one of the few things he had carried out of Virginia, a slim gold band with a small dark stone that he had been told was a garnet. He had been carrying it for 3 months. He had taken it out and looked at it many times. He had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment, he had come to understand, was any moment that was genuinely true, and this moment was as true as any he had known. "Lydia," he had said. She had looked up. He had put the ring on the table between them, and she had looked at it and then at him. "I told you I would ask when the time was right," he had said. "I've been waiting for the right time, and I've realized the right time is now, because I've been planning my future as though you are in it, and I'd like to know whether you're willing to make that official." He had paused. "Will you marry me?" She had looked at the ring for a long time. He had watched her face move through things he could not entirely read, and it had been one of the most difficult silences of his life, because he could not control the outcome, and he understood that this was right. Then she had taken the ring from the table and held it in her palm and looked at it, and she had said, in a voice that was full and warm and carrying everything she had been careful not to say too quickly or too soon, "Yes, yes, Arthur, I will." He had put the ring on her finger and she had looked at it on her hand, and then she had looked at him across the kitchen table in the evening light, and whatever had been building between them since an October morning in 1881, when he had stood at her counter needing flour and salt and rope, and found instead something he had not known he was missing. All of it had arrived at this point, and it was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was the kind of moment that makes a man understand what all the other moments were preparing him for. He had kissed her, and she had kissed him back, and then she had laughed, a real and unbridled laugh that he had heard from her rarely enough that it was extraordinary. The laugh of a woman who has decided to trust something and has discovered that the trust was warranted. "I should tell you," he had said, when they had both recovered from the laughing, "that I almost left the territory a 3rd time." She had looked at him sharply. "When? Last month," he had said, "when Mercer told me the position was ending. I had a letter from a ranching operation in Texas that was offering very good wages, and I was seriously considering it for about 3 days. And then?" she had asked. He had looked at her with the ring on her finger and the coffee cooling between them and said, "And then I realized that a man who rides away from the best thing that's ever happened to him, because the professional circumstances got uncertain, is a man who does not deserve the best thing that's ever happened to him." She had held his gaze for a long moment and said, "You were going to tell me eventually, weren't you?" "Tonight, apparently," he had said, "with the proposal included, so you have full information." She had shaken her head in a way that was exasperated and fond and said, "3 times, Arthur." "3 times," he had agreed. "And you're still here." "I'm still here," he had said. "Why?" she had asked, the same question she had asked in October, but meaning something different now, asking not for the reason he had stayed, but for the reason he kept choosing it. He had looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight of a Tuesday evening in April. In the 2nd year of a life he had not planned and was grateful for every day, and said, "Because you are the reason I could not leave on any of them." She had looked at him for a moment that was long and quiet and full, and then she had reached across the table and taken his hand. They were married in June of 1883, on a Saturday, in the building that served simultaneously as Caldera Creek School and its church, with Mrs. Albright and Tucker from the Mercer Ranch, and a number of townspeople who had watched the whole of the courtship with the warm and slightly proprietorial interest that small communities take in the romances conducted within them. Lydia wore a dress that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Santa Fe, a deep cream color with small pearl buttons, and her hair was done up carefully by Mrs. Albright, who turned out to have a talent for this that nobody had previously needed to discover. Arthur wore his best clothes and looked, in the estimation of several people who recorded the occasion in their letters and diaries, like a man who could not believe his good fortune, and was being very deliberate about not looking away from the source of it. The ceremony was brief and honest, as both of them wanted, without unnecessary elaboration. When asked if he took this woman, Arthur had said yes in a voice that was quiet and absolute, the voice of a decision already made and resting in peace. When asked if she took this man, Lydia had said yes with her eyes on his and the ring from his mother on her finger, a look that contained everything she had been careful with and was now freely giving. Tucker had organized a small celebration at the saloon afterward, which was the primary venue for Caldera Creek's community life, and someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing that went on until quite late, and Arthur danced with his wife more than twice this time, and did not pretend that any of it was accidental. They had agreed, before the wedding, on the practical shape of their life together. Arthur had formalized an arrangement with Holloway's grain operation for the season, and was developing his horse training work with 3 ranches south of town. Lydia kept the store, because the store was hers and she was its, and this was not a thing to be altered but a thing to be built around, and Arthur had understood this from the first. They lived above the store in the rooms that had been Lydia's alone, and Arthur filled the small additional space with a considered economy, not because there was no room for his things, but because he had spent a decade owning very little, and the habit of minimal possession was slow to change. The first months of the marriage had the quality of people discovering the daily texture of something they had previously only seen from the outside. Living with another person, learning the small geography of their habits and preferences and moods, was a different knowledge than the knowledge of courtship. There were adjustments. There were evenings when one or the other was too tired for conversation, and the silence needed to be navigated. There were small disagreements about practical things, the way Arthur left his boots by the door instead of the back room, the way Lydia kept books in every available flat space, including the kitchen table, which required preliminary excavation before meals could be served there. None of it was serious. All of it was real. What made it work, as far as Arthur could identify the mechanism, was that they had always been honest with each other, and they continued to be honest with each other. And honesty in a marriage is like a sound foundation under a house. You are not always thinking about it, but everything you do is built on it. He also found that living with Lydia Ford, now Lydia Townsend, though she kept Ford in the store's name for reasons of commerce and also reasons of sentiment, was an ongoing education in the kind of strength he had previously not had the vocabulary for. She managed the store, the accounts, the relationships with suppliers and customers, and the larger commercial ecosystem of the territory, with an intelligence and capability that was simply part of her, not performed, not labored, not apologized for. And she did this while also being, in the private space of their life together, a woman of considerable warmth and humor and occasional, guarded vulnerability that she allowed him to see because she had decided to trust him with the whole of herself. He was aware that this trust was a more significant gift than any tangible thing she could have offered. He tried to deserve it consistently, knowing that trust, once extended, requires ongoing service. By September of 1883, Arthur's horse training operation had grown enough to require him to think seriously about finding a small piece of land. He had been working from borrowed corrals at the ranches he contracted with, which was practical but limiting. He had been saving steadily, and Lydia had suggested, with a directness about financial matters that he found refreshing in a time when women were not expected to engage directly with the financial planning of a household, that the store had run a surplus in the previous 2 quarters, and she thought they should consider it joint capital for whatever came next. He had been struck by this, by the we of it, by her offering without hesitation what was hers as part of what was theirs. "Are you sure?" he had said. "We're building something," she had said. "That's what you told me in February. We build it with everything we have." He had found a small parcel of land east of town in October, 12 acres with a creek running through the northern edge, and an existing structure that had once been someone's attempt at a homestead and had since mostly fallen down. It was not an impressive start. But Arthur had looked at the collapsed structure and the good creek and the flat ground that would take a corral well, and he had seen the shape of something that was not yet there and could be built to be there, which was the specific kind of vision that made men good at beginnings. He had bought it with their combined savings, and he had begun building with his own hands slowly, on weekends and in the evenings, because the construction was a future being built in present tense, and he found it deeply satisfying in a way that only things you are making for yourself and the people you love can be satisfying. Tucker, who was both a foreman and a man of generous practical instincts, came out several Saturdays to help with the corral posts. Mrs. Albright's husband, who worked at the Holloway grain operation, helped with the roof of the main structure. Even some of the ranchers Arthur had been contracting with sent hands over for a Saturday of work, the territory's tradition of communal labor that came from the understanding that in hard country, neighbors were not a nicety but a necessity. Lydia came out every Sunday afternoon and sat on the flattest part of the ground with a blanket and a book, and was present without being in the way. And sometimes she walked around the property with Arthur while he explained what things would be, pointing at empty air and saying, "Here is the second corral. Here is where the small barn goes," and she would look at the empty air and nod, seeing it with him, which was one of the best things about being married to a woman of imagination. In December of 1883, Lydia told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with the same directness she brought to everything, and he had sat with this information for a moment that was full to the point of inadequacy, because there were not words of sufficient size for what he felt, which was something large and quiet and terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. He had stood up from the table and gone to her and put his hands on her face and looked at her for a long moment in which he tried to communicate everything he felt without having the vocabulary for it, and then he had said, somewhat inadequately, "Lydia." "I know," she had said. "Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she had said. "I'm told it gets harder in the spring." He had laughed, somewhat helplessly, because laughing was one of the available responses to things that were too large for other responses, and she had leaned her forehead against his, and they had stood in the kitchen above the store in December of 1883, two people who had found each other by accident and stayed by choice, with the beginning of their family between them. The spring of 1884 was, as predicted, harder. Lydia ran the store through the winter and into the spring with her characteristic determination, adjusting when she had to and not complaining about the adjustments, though there were evenings when she was plainly exhausted, and Arthur managed the cooking and the household with a willingness that had grown naturally from his general conviction that work was work, and gender had nothing to do with who was capable of performing it. He had the small barn finished by March and the second corral by April, and the property east of town was beginning to look like what he had seen in the empty air, which was a satisfaction he shared with Lydia on a Sunday afternoon in April when she came out and stood with him and looked at it. "It looks like something," she had said. "It does," he had agreed. "What are you going to call it?" He had considered this. "I thought Townsend stock," he had said, "but I'd rather call it something that means more." She had looked at him. "Ford and Townsend," she had said, "both of what it came from." He had thought about this and felt something settle into place like the last piece of a well-fitted joint. "Ford and Townsend," he had agreed. "That's exactly right." Their son was born in June of 1884, almost precisely 1 year after their wedding. He arrived on a hot evening with the help of the territory's doctor, a capable man named Farrell who had come to Caldera Creek 6 months prior, and 2 of the women from town who had experience in these matters. Arthur had waited outside in the manner required by convention, and the manner that he had found entirely agonizing. And when Farrell had come to the door and told him that Lydia and the baby were both well, he had pressed his back against the outside wall of the building and let out a breath that seemed to contain a year's worth of held things. He had gone in and found Lydia propped up against the pillows with an expression of exhausted triumph and their son in her arms, red-faced and indignant about his recent arrival. And Arthur had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them with a feeling that was past words, entirely past words, a feeling that had no adequate container. "Hello," he had said to the baby, who was not impressed. "He's healthy," Lydia had said, with the authoritative certainty of someone who has just accomplished something demanding and knows it. 7 pounds, Farrell thinks. Good lungs. Clearly, Arthur had said, because the baby had begun to express himself on the subject of existence with considerable volume. They named him Elias Arthur Townsend, Elias for Lydia's father and Arthur for Arthur, because Lydia had said that the 2 men she had loved most deserved to be combined in the name of the person they were beginning, and Arthur had not been able to speak for a moment after she said this. Elias grew in the way that healthy children grow, noisily and with great conviction, and the rooms above Ford's dry goods became the kind of rooms that are full of small things and large sounds, and the particular organized chaos of a young life accommodated into a previously ordered space. Lydia returned to running the store when Elias was 3 months old, with the help of a girl named Etta who had been looking for work, and proved unexpectedly good with both goods and babies. Arthur managed the mornings at the property east of town and was home by mid-afternoon, and they had arranged their life with the same practical intelligence they brought to everything, not perfectly, but thoughtfully, and with good humor about the imperfections. By the summer of 1885, Ford and Townsend stock had a reputation in the territory that had grown beyond Caldera Creek. Arthur trained horses with a method that was patient and effective, and resulted in animals that were better tempered and more reliably useful than most of what the territory's ranchers could buy elsewhere. And word of this had traveled, as word in the West traveled, through the networks of men who depended on good horses for their livelihoods. He had 2 full-time contracts and several part-time arrangements, and he had hired a young man from a ranch south of town named Jesse, who was 18 and had a gift with animals that Arthur recognized and cultivated. The territory was changing around them, as all territories in this period were changing. The railroad had come closer. The cattle drives were shifting, and in some places ending as fences changed the nature of the open range. There were new people arriving from the east and old ways of doing things gradually giving way to newer ones, and this was neither wholly good nor wholly bad but simply the motion of time, which moves in the West as it moves everywhere, indifferent to whether the people within it are ready. Arthur watched these changes with the attention of a man who had moved through enough of the West to understand its rhythms, and he made adjustments as they were needed, shifting his operation toward horses for the newer purposes that were emerging, the horses needed for the growing towns and the smaller farming operations that were beginning to replace some of the great ranching outfits. He was not wealthy, but he was stable, and stability in the New Mexico territory in 1885 was its own considerable achievement. Lydia's store continued to anchor her end of their partnership, as she thought of it, with the frankness that characterized how she thought about everything. She had expanded the store's stock modestly in the previous year, adding a small selection of books and printed materials that had nothing to do with dry goods in the traditional sense, but that she had always wanted to carry, and that proved, to no one's particular surprise, popular with the women and children of the town who had limited access to reading material. This brought a different kind of customer into the store, and added a dimension to the commercial life of Caldera Creek that had not existed before. And Lydia managed this expansion with the same careful attention to the numbers that had always been her method. There was a moment, late in the summer of 1885, that Arthur would remember for many years. He had come back from the East property in the late afternoon to find Lydia in the store with Elias on her hip, 14 months old and full of opinions about everything within reach. And she was showing a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, a selection of books, talking about them in the way she had talked about books with Arthur in those early days in the kitchen, with genuine excitement and the generous impulse to share something loved. The girl was the daughter of one of the newer families in town, recent arrivals from Kansas, and she looked at the books with a hunger that was recognizable to anyone who had ever felt it. Arthur had stood in the doorway and watched and felt, in the particular way that significant moments sometimes announce themselves, that he was looking at the truest version of the woman he had married, the woman who existed when she was entirely herself, doing what she was meant to do in the place she was meant to do it. The store and the books and Elias on her hip and her attention, given wholly and generously to a 12-year-old girl who wanted to read, and the afternoon light on all of it. She had looked up and seen him in the doorway, and her expression had shifted into the particular warmth she reserved for him, the warmth that she no longer contained or controlled because there was no longer a need to, and she had said, "We're discussing options." "I can see that," he had said. "Don't let me interrupt." He had gone upstairs to start supper, and Elias had come toddling up the stairs after him because Elias was at the age where his primary interest was in whatever Arthur was doing, and Arthur had started the cooking with a 1-year-old contributing enthusiastic and largely unhelpful commentary, and the whole of it had been so far from the life he had expected to be living, and so entirely, specifically right, that he had to stop for a moment and simply acknowledge it. He had almost left this territory 3 times. The first time in March of 1882, heading for the Pecos River. The second time in July, heading for Colorado. The third time in March of 1883, heading for Texas. 3 times he had looked at the road and calculated the distance, and 3 times something had intervened, and the something had always been Lydia Ford, in one form or another. The memory of her face in the store when Prout was threatening her. The sight of her in the fire-smoked storeroom saying, "I've got it handled," in a voice that was doing more work than any voice should have to. The image of her in a blue dress at the edge of a summer dance, talking to Mrs. Albright with her hair carefully up and her eyes warm. She had not asked him to stay, not once. She had not known she was keeping him in those early days. She had simply been herself, which had been sufficient. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that was hard on the ranchers and harder on the dry goods trade, because when ranchers had less money they bought less of everything, and the store felt the contraction. Arthur's horse business was somewhat insulated from this, because the drought did not change the need for well-trained horses, but he had watched Lydia manage the store through 3 tightening months with the same calm competence she brought to everything, pulling from reserves, managing credit carefully, making strategic reductions in stock that preserved the store's most essential function while shedding the margin that was not immediately necessary. She did not panic. He found this remarkable every time he watched her face a difficulty. She was not incapable of fear, he knew that, had seen it in quiet moments when the territory's various uncertainties pressed in, but she faced difficulty as she had always faced it, clearly and practically, and without allowing the emotion to precede the strategy. He told her this one evening during the drought when Elias was in bed and the store was quiet below them, and they were sitting together at the kitchen table where so many important things had happened between them. "You are the most capable person I know," he said. "I want you to know that I see that. I see it clearly." She looked at him with the slight startlement she still sometimes had when he said things directly. "I manage," she said. "You do more than manage," he said. "You lead. The store, the accounts, the relationships in this town. You know what's needed before anyone asks. You do it without expecting acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge it." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding how much of herself to give to the moment. This was a thing she still did, measured out herself in portions, a habit from years of not having anyone to receive the whole of her. She gave him the whole of it. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was full and real, and received the compliment as the serious, intended thing it was rather than deflecting it into something smaller. "Thank you for staying," she added after a moment. He looked at her across the table. "I'm sorry it took me 3 attempts to get it right," he said. She shook her head and the corner of her mouth moved. "You got it right the first time," she said. "You just took some time to notice." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the kitchen while the territory dried out beyond their windows, and he thought that whatever the territory did, whatever the years did, he would not leave this. There was no road long enough and no opportunity generous enough to make leaving this make sense. He had been a man who ran toward the next thing for a decade, and he had discovered that the next thing turned out to be exactly where he was. The drought broke in September with 3 days of steady rain that the territory received with the desperate gratitude of the thirsty. The ranches recovered slowly, as they always did, and the store's business returned to its previous level by October. Arthur had added 2 new training contracts by November, and by the end of 1886, the operation east of town was the most stable it had ever been. Their daughter was born in March of 1887. They named her Clara Townsend, and she arrived with considerably less drama than Elia's had, as though she had already decided that efficiency was her preference. She was small and determined, and regarded the world from her first weeks with an evaluating interest that made Lydia say she had her grandfather's eyes in their particular quality of attention. Elia's, who was 2 years and 9 months old and had opinions about everything, received his sister with a combination of jealousy and fascinated curiosity that resolved itself, over several months, into a proprietary affection. He was particularly focused on Clara's feet, which he found inexplicably interesting, and he would sit beside her and hold her hand with the careful seriousness of someone assigned an important task. Arthur watched both of his children with the feeling that he had learned to stop trying to name, because the available words were all inadequate. He had not grown up in a family that had words for the larger feelings, and he had grown up too quickly in any case, and the result was that the feelings lived in him without vocabulary, expressed in other ways, in the work he did, and the consistency of his presence and the attention he paid, and the particular way he had of putting his hand on Lydia's shoulder when he passed her in the store or the kitchen, a gesture of contact that was small and automatic, and said everything the words did not. By 1888, Caldera Creek was a different town than the one Arthur had ridden into in October of 1881. It had grown by about 1/3 in population, with new families and new businesses, and the kind of gradual accretion of civic institution that turned a raw Western settlement into something with more permanence. There was a proper bank now, which had not existed when Arthur arrived. The school had been rebuilt as a dedicated building, separating it finally from the church and the meeting hall functions. The road that ran through the center of town had been graded and improved. Ford's Dry Goods remained on the main street with Elia's Ford's imperfect sign, which Lydia had still not replaced, and which Arthur had come to understand she would never replace, not because she couldn't but because the imperfect letters in her father's hand were the most honest testament to him that remained visible in the world, and she was keeping them. He had built Lydia a new step stool the previous fall, a better one again, because the second one had worn out, and she had looked at the new one, and then at him with the same expression she had given him the first time, the look that was not quite gratitude and not quite pride but something balanced between the two, except that now the expression had history in it, 7 years of history. And that history added a quality to it that made it the most fully realized version of the expression it had started as. On an evening in October of 1888, Arthur sat on the porch of the house they had built on the east property, the house that had grown properly now around the original modest structure, with a real porch and 2 proper bedrooms for the children and a kitchen that was larger than the one above the store, and that Lydia had organized with the same meticulous intelligence she brought to her store's inventory. Elias was running in the yard with the particular focused energy of a 4-year-old who has not yet reached the hour of exhaustion. Clara was on the porch with Lydia, who was reading, with Clara asleep against her arm. The evening light was doing what New Mexico evening light did, which was to make everything briefly golden and unreasonably beautiful, and the horses in the corral were quiet, and the property that had been 12 acres of collapsed hope when he bought it was now the solid reality of a life well built. Arthur thought about the road. He thought about it the way a man thinks about a road he has decided not to take, not with longing, but with the curiosity of understanding what he had chosen against. The road to the Pecos River, the road to Colorado, the road to Texas. 3 roads in 3 years, and each time the same weight on the other side of the scale, the weight that had kept him here, that had turned leaving into a decision he found he could not make. Lydia looked up from her book and found him looking at her, and she held his gaze with the steady warmth that lived in her eyes when she was not managing the world and was simply being in it, in this particular spot, with these particular people. "What are you thinking about?" she asked in the quiet voice she used when the children were asleep. "The first time I almost left," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "March of '82. I was going to write to Cal Draper and tell him I was coming," he said. "I had it all reasoned out. Another territory, steady wages, no complications." "And then," she said, which was the same question she had asked before, and he gave her the same answer and a different one. "And then I walked into your store to buy tobacco I didn't need," he said, "and you looked at me over the counter in that particular way you have, and I forgot what I was reasoning." She looked at him for a moment with Clara asleep on her arm and Elias still running in the yard, and the horses quiet in the corral, and the evening light on all of it, and she said, "I remember that day." "Do you?" He was surprised a little. "You came in for tobacco," she said, "and you stood at the counter longer than you needed to, and you looked at everything except me, and then you looked at me, and I thought to myself, there is a man who does not know what he wants." She paused. "I was wrong about that. You knew what you wanted. You just needed some time to let yourself have it." He looked at her with 7 years and 2 children and a property east of town, and a life larger than anything he had deserved between them. "You never said anything." "I was waiting," she said. "You were worth waiting for." He stood up from his chair and crossed the porch and sat beside her, careful of Clara asleep on her arm, and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the comfortable ease of years, and they sat on their porch in the October evening and watched Elias finally run out of momentum and slow and look around, slightly confused by the stopping, and then trot back toward them with his arms out. "Finished," Arthur called. "I'm not tired," Elias announced, which was belied entirely by his expression. "Of course not," Arthur said. "Come sit with us." Elias climbed onto the porch and arranged himself between his parents with the authority of a child who has never doubted his welcome, and Clara stirred but did not wake, and the 4 of them sat in the last of the evening light as the sky over New Mexico turned from gold to the deep orange and rose of sunset. It was a good life. It was not a life without difficulty, not a life without work or worry or the ordinary sorrows that came with living in a raw and beautiful and sometimes brutal country. The territory would continue to change, and they would continue to change with it. There would be harder winters and dry summers, and the ongoing work of the store and the horses and the children and the relationship itself, which required its own continuous tending, like everything alive. But it was good. It was built from things that were real, from the specific and particular attention that 2 people had paid each other over years, from the honesty they had chosen and kept choosing, from the trust that Lydia had extended and Arthur had tried every day to deserve. It was built from a step stool and a cup of coffee in February, and a dance in June, and a garnet ring that had belonged to his mother. It was built from 3 roads not taken, and the reason they had not been taken, which was standing right here and had always been standing right here. He had said he was done with the territory 3 times already. She had been the reason he had not left on any of them. And here, in the October evening of 1888, with his children beside him and Lydia warm against his shoulder, and the horses in the corral and the horses in the corral, and the mountains going purple in the fading light, he understood, with the full and complete understanding that can only come after enough time has passed to see the whole shape of a thing, that he had not been done with the territory at all. He had been done with the version of himself that moved through territories without putting roots down. He had been done with the particular loneliness of a man who keeps his coat packed, because he has decided that belonging somewhere is a thing that happens to other people. The territory had not been done with him. Caldera Creek had not been done with him. Lydia Ford had not been done with him, though she had never said so, had never made a claim on him or asked him to stay, had simply been herself so completely and so honestly that staying had been the only possible response, the only answer that made sense when you looked at the question clearly. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she made a small sound against his shoulder that was contentment of the most genuine and uncomplicated kind. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not for anything specific or everything specific." "For what?" she asked. He thought about it. "For being here when I rode in," he said. "For being exactly who you are, for the coffee in February, for saying yes." She was quiet for a moment, and Clara slept, and Elias was making the particular quiet noise of a child trying to stay awake and failing, and the last of the light was leaving the sky. "Thank you for staying," Lydia said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And it was the truest thing he had said in 38 years of living, truer than any of the calculations he had made about territories and wages and roads, truer than the reasonable arguments that had nearly sent him to the Pecos and Colorado and Texas, truer than anything that had existed in him before the specific morning in October of 1881, when he had walked into a narrow-fronted store with an imperfect sign and found, standing on a step stool that was too short for the task, the reason that all the road reasoning would eventually and entirely stop. He was not going anywhere. This was the place. This was the life. This was, in all the ways that mattered, the very thing that he had been without knowing he was looking for, which turned out to be the same as what he had found, which turned out to be enough, which turned out to be everything. The stars came out over New Mexico the way they always did, abundantly and without apology, the way the sky in the west has always offered its best gifts, not quietly but with the whole generous sweep of it, as though it knows that the people below it have been through enough and deserve the spectacle. Arthur Townsend sat on his porch with his family and looked up at it, and did not think about roads at all.